It's 478 Sunday. Yes, 5 years ago we made a decision around here. We decided that we didn't just want to be a church in the 478. We wanted to be a church that was for the 478, that was for our community. We decided we want our community to know, if they don't know anything about our church, that we are a group of people who are for them, that we love them, that we care about them. And for the last 5 years, we've been doing our best to keep this slogan, to keep this logo in front of you. We put it on shirts, right? Put it on hats, put it on magnets, put it on coffee mugs, put it on everything that we can think of. And it's really caught on, but just to be clear, we don't want this to be a campaign we launched in the past. We want this to be a culture we live out in the present. We do really want to be a people who are for the 478, who are for our community. So once a year, we're going to just pause. We're going to build this into the rhythm of our year. We're going to pause and take a moment and ask the question, what does it really look like for us as the people of God in this community to be for the 478? Now, I don't know what would happen if you surveyed like the people of Houston County, the people of Middle Georgia, and asked them this question. I don't know what their responses would be, but if you ask them this question, in your opinion, what is the church for? I think some people would say God, maybe. Maybe they'd say missions. I think a lot of people would struggle to answer that question, honestly. People who don't go to church or who used to go to church, they probably struggle with that question. But if you change one word in this question, if you said, in your opinion, what is the church against, I think they'd be really talkative. I think they'd be more than prepared to answer that question. I think they'd have lots of opinions and insights. They'd have a list, right? They'd have examples. They may even have stories. In fact, if I had to guess, many of them would say something like this. It feels like the church doesn't like people like me. Or it feels like the church said no to me a long time ago. Or it feels like the church is more against me than it is for me. Now, we may disagree with some of those responses. We may say that's not fair. But here's the thing. What people in the 478 say about us may not always be fair, but it is often felt. They have had experiences that have caused them to believe this way, to think this way about the church. And perception matters, because if people don't believe that we are for them, then it doesn't matter how right we are. It doesn't matter how clear we are. It doesn't matter how passionate we are about what God's called us to do. And it doesn't even matter to them how biblical we are. Because if people don't truly believe, if they're not truly convinced that we are for them, then guess what? They're not going to stick around long enough to actually find out. Anyway, because there are people in our community who feel like the church is against them, it only makes sense that one of our goals here at Southside is, as much as we're able to do this, is to address this, to tackle this head on, to convince people, at least in this community, that we really are for them, that we really aren't against them. And this probably isn't going to surprise any of you, but to do this, we must take our cues from who? Jesus, right? I want to take our cues from Jesus. In fact, if you've ever paid any attention to the life and teachings of Jesus, then you know he made it clear that if there's nothing else about Jesus, he was for people. He loved all kinds of people, and he loved them right where they were at, regardless of where they were at. And if you've read any of the different accounts of his life, then you also know that the religious leaders didn't like this about him one bit. The Pharisees, all of them. In fact, the religious leaders, I'll say it this way, the religious leaders were often against Jesus because of who he seemed to be for, weren't they? They were against Jesus because of who he seemed to be for. But even though they didn't like Jesus, almost everyone in the first century loved Jesus. And they loved him because it was obvious that he loved them first. He initiated that love. It was obvious that he was for people and not against them. And although we could look at any number of instances in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, these accounts of Jesus' life, I want us to look at something from Matthew's account of Jesus' life. And I want to look at this account because Matthew tells the story of when he personally met Jesus. Here's how he begins this account. He says, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told him. Matthew says Jesus is coming into town. This would have been Capernaum. And he comes to a tax collector's booth, and not just any tax collector's booth, but his tax collector's booth. This is the tax collector's booth Matthew would be set up at. Now, tax collectors have never been popular in any culture, correct? But they were especially unpopular in first century Israel because they were collecting taxes for the dreaded evil Roman Empire. In fact, if you were Jewish, like Matthew was, he grew up in a Jewish family, and you decided that you wanted to pursue a career in collecting taxes for Rome, well, you didn't just lose friends, you lost almost everything. You got kicked out of the local place of worship, the synagogue. You lost your dearest friends. You lost the respect of the community. And more than likely, you probably even lost the relationship that you had with your parents, with your family. To choose to be a tax collector was to choose to enter a career field where almost everyone was against you, especially in Israel. So please understand, Matthew wasn't just like disliked in his community. He was written off. No one in the entire city of Capernaum wanted anything to do with him except for his fellow tax collectors. Anyway, on this day, Jesus shows up to Matthew's tax collecting station. He's probably counting coins, I don't know. And he says two words I'm sure Matthew never expected to hear. He says, "Follow me." Hey, Matthew, do you want to change career paths? Do you want to do something different with your life? And if you do, follow me. Now, I imagine Matthew hears so much more than just an invitation. I imagine he hears, you're not too far gone. Even though you've been told you're too far gone, you're not too far gone. You're not disqualified, even though so many people in Capernaum would agree that you're disqualified. You're not forgotten. Like Matthew, God can still use you. Your life's not over. And in this moment, even though it feels like everyone else in this community is against him, he understands that Jesus is for him. In a community, again, where no one else appreciated Matthew, liked Matthew, Jesus is for him. And when you realize Jesus is for you, and so many of us in this room have realized this at some point in our lives, but when you realize Jesus is for you, it changes everything. And this is why Matthew does what he does next. He follows Jesus, but notice what happens after that. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting in the tax collector's booth, and notice what he says, "Follow me." He told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. Matthew's like, "Hey, I'm Team Jesus. I will absolutely follow you. Let's go do this thing. Where are we going? Doesn't matter. I am committed to following you." He leaves the tax collecting station behind. Apparently, he leaves his tax collecting buddies behind. He leaves the money, the lucrative career. He would have made a lot of money behind. And Matthew doesn't tell us why he drops everything so quickly and begins to follow Jesus. But two options from my perspective. Maybe there was something magnetic about Jesus, and I think we can all agree that there was. Or maybe there was something pathetic about his own life. Or maybe it was, this is probably the case, he didn't like being the villain in everyone's story in Capernaum. Or maybe it was some combination of both of those. I think both are true. There was something certainly magnetic about Jesus, and there's something pathetic about his own life. And here's what we do know. Whenever you truly understand that Jesus is for you, you can't be who you used to be anymore. Whenever you truly understand, come to grips with the fact that Jesus is for you, he loves you, he has a plan for you, you can't be who you used to be anymore. Now, this is not the end of Matthew's story. Here's what I was alluding to earlier. Notice what happens next. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, I don't know if that's later that day or months down the line, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. So not long, we don't know again, is this a month? Is this 2 months? Is it the next day? Is it that night? But not long after his decision to follow Jesus, Matthew invites all of his tax collecting buddies to his house for a dinner party of sorts, for the purpose, it seems to me, of introducing his friends to Jesus. And it's not just a handful of these guys. Notice how many are there. Many tax collectors and sinners, who are the kinds of people who are friends with tax collectors. Many people far from God. Now, I don't know how this makes you feel, but I love that Matthew doesn't start following Jesus and leave all of his tax collecting buddies behind. Say, "I'm done with you guys, never gonna see you again." I love that he says, "Hey, I want you to come over and I want you to meet someone who's changed my life for the better." And I also love that Jesus when Matthew organizes this little get together, doesn't get up and leave the party. He doesn't excuse himself from this dinner because of these dinner guests. He stays. And I think that he stays because he sees the opportunity to influence the kinds of people who need him the most. He stays because he wants tax collectors and sinners to know that he is for them. Now, let me be clear about something. Jesus being at the table with these tax collecting people and these sinners is not an endorsement of their behavior. It's not an endorsement of their career path. In fact, just to be overly clear, Jesus in this moment is not endorsing greed. He's not approving corruption, and tax collectors are so corrupt. He's not ignoring truth. None of those things. In fact, if I could just say it just in a summary statement, Jesus never sins with sinners, right? He may hang out with sinners, he may minister to sinners, but he never sins with sinners. He loves messy people. And I think more than anything else, if you're asking me, what's happening here? Well, I think Jesus is telling us that it's possible to be against the sin, but be for the sinner. It's possible to be against the sin, but at the same time, and I'm not saying this is easy to do, but at the same time to be for the sinner. In fact, if you didn't already know this, Jesus is absolutely against their sin. Read some of his sermons in the accounts of his life. He does not approve of all the many different ways that these tax collecting individuals have been taking advantage of people. But at the same time, he absolutely loves and accepts every single one of these tax collecting individuals because he knows their story and he wants them to know that he is for them. And to this day, just so you know, Jesus is still against the sin, but for the sinner. And aren't you grateful for that? I mean, I know I'm on the receiving end of that. You've been on the receiving end of that as well. Now, I know what some of you are probably thinking. You're probably thinking, Matt, it's okay for Jesus to show up at a dinner party with a lot of tax collecting riffraff and sinners because he's Jesus. I mean, he's the perfect, sinless Son of God. But I don't think that any of us today who wear his name, who are associated with him, who are following him, I don't think any of us should be doing this sort of thing. I think we should be staying as far away from sinners as possible. If that's what you think, I want to remind you that all of this happens at Matthew's house, right? Matthew, one of Jesus' followers, Matthew's the one who invites all of them over. Matthew's the one who wants to introduce all of his friends to Jesus. And with that said, Matthew has certainly separated himself from their practices. He's walked away from the lucrative tax collecting business, but he hasn't walked away from his friends. And if we're following Jesus and we have friends who aren't following Jesus, we don't need to walk away from our friends either. Now, there need to be boundaries. We need to be careful. We need to, if we're going to be tempted, we need to watch out, be careful. But I love that Matthew, yes, he quits collecting taxes, but he doesn't quit on these tax collectors. He stops taking advantage of people, but he doesn't stop these friendships that he has with these people who need a relationship with him. Now, as I've already sort of alluded to, not everyone is thrilled about this dinner party. In fact, there are some people who are not excited or who are not happy that Jesus is for tax collectors. And this isn't that surprising because whenever grace shows up, criticism from religious people probably isn't that far behind. Notice what happens next. When the Pharisees saw this whole party, right, this dinner party, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" We don't know if they're just outside the house, it's a culture of hospitality. Maybe they're even inside the house. We're not really sure, but evidently they've been watching all of this unfold and they have a problem with this party. And their problem, and I think you can see this, their problem is not with the venue, nothing wrong with this house. Their problem is not with the food. Their problem is not with the music. Their problem is with the guest list. They don't think Jesus should be hanging out with these sort of tax collecting riffraff. But notice they don't talk to Jesus about this. They approach his disciples. And can't you just see them like with their arms crossed, a scowl on their face? Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners. Or to say it the way, maybe in a more modern way, why is your teacher for tax collectors and sinners? Now, they say this because in their minds, and people still say this today, in their minds, proximity means approval. If you're close to someone, then it means you endorse whatever they're doing. But that's not, again, that's not the way of Jesus. They're saying, hey, if you sit with sinners, you must be a sinner. You must support sinners. That's their assumption. And even though all these religious leaders are saying this behind Jesus' back, they're saying it just to his disciples, Jesus somehow hears this, and notice what happens next. On hearing this, what the Pharisees were saying about him, Jesus said, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Jesus says, if you want to know why I'm here, if you want to know why I accepted the invitation to Matthew's little dinner party, it's not complicated. Doctors go where sick people are. Doctors go where sick people are. Now, if you're like, man, what is he saying? Well, he's essentially saying this. Sick people don't need someone standing at a distance diagnosing them. Well, that's your problem, and that's your problem, and that's your problem. Sick people need someone willing to get close enough to treat them, to help them, to bind up those wounds, to offer up that medicine. Now, the Pharisees, of course, and if you know them, and many of you do, they were excellent at diagnosing, weren't they? They were experts at diagnosing. They could spot sin a mile away. But diagnosing alone never heals anyone. And that's what Jesus is exposing here. He's saying, look, you guys are fantastic. You're the best. You're legendary at identifying sickness. No one does it better than you do. However, at the same time, you're not so good about helping anyone get better. And Jesus' point is, look, people who are sick don't need someone to tell them they're sick as much as they need someone who will help them get better. People who are sick, at least deep down, Matthew knew this. I think that's why he left right away. He knew he was sick. He knew he was hopeless. He knew his life was ultimately meaningless and purposeless. He knew he was missing something, lacking something. He didn't need anyone to tell him that. He knew that deep down. And Jesus is saying, hey, people who are sick don't need someone to tell them they're sick. They need people who will help them get better. So Jesus is saying, look, these people you call riffraff and scum and sinners, these people that you don't want anything to do with, that you're trying to stay as far away from as possible, well, they're sick. And they're not going to get any better unless people like me or people like you help them get better. And then Jesus challenges them with some scripture, kind of gives them some homework. He says, but go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Now, when Jesus says, go and learn what this means, he's telling the Pharisees in a somewhat pointed, sharp way. He's saying, look, you guys know the scriptures backwards and forwards, and yet you don't know them as well as you think you know them. In fact, I want to give you some homework. I want you to go and learn what this means. You know what Hosea said. You know the very words of Scripture, but you've missed the heart of Scripture. And so he quotes Hosea, and he says, look, God is not impressed with your religious performance, your religious, showmanship, your religious accolades. God wants you to be merciful to the people in your life, the people in this community who need mercy. To say it another way, Jesus is arguing that if your version of holiness, if your version of godliness keeps you away from sinners, you don't understand the heart of God. If your version, of holiness or godliness keeps you away from sinners, you've missed the heart of God, because God is for people and not against them. Now, with all that said, Matthew ends his story and kind of moves in a direction. And so at this point, we have to ask, okay, what does all of this mean for all of us? Like, how do we bring this ancient conversation that Jesus has with Matthew and then Jesus has with these Pharisees, how do we bring that forward and apply it to our 21st century lives? Well, before I sort of apply this or try to apply this more specifically, I want to apply this generally first. I don't know if you are aware of this or not, but there are some 450,000 people in Houston County and the counties connected to it, the counties that border us. That's a lot of people, right? I mean, it's almost 500,000 people at this point who live in our county or the county next to us. And many of them, to use Jesus' language, are sick. They're unwell. They need a doctor, not physically, of course, but spiritually unwell. There's a lot of people out of that number who I would argue need a doctor, who need hope, who need help, who need someone to move in their direction. Someone to say, hey, follow me, go to church with me, get to know me, come to my house for dinner. They need people like that. And unfortunately, many of these people, and maybe this was your story at one point, but many of these people don't believe church is for them. Now, I'll say it this way, some of them believe the church is for good people. People who have their act together, right? People who obey the 10 Commandments, not people like them. Some assume they'll be judged before they ever even take a seat in this place. That we're going to be looking at them, staring at them, watching them carefully, identifying what are they wearing? Are they okay? Is it okay for them to show up in this place? Some of them have already decided even that God doesn't want anything to do with them. And to be honest, the church hasn't always held that perception. In fact, oftentimes, the church has reinforced this perception. So people show up in churches and they feel judged. They feel unwelcomed. They feel like they're not accepted because the people in the building have made them feel that way. It's not God who's made them feel that way, but the people in the building who made them feel that way. So here's the question. We have a choice. Will we be the kind of church that sort of stands outside the house, diagnosing and saying this and this and this and that's right? And I'm against sin, just so you know, okay? I'll make that clear later. I'm against sin. But are we gonna be the kinds of people who sit out there and just diagnose and diagnose and diagnose and point the finger and point the finger and point the finger and judge? Or are we gonna be the kinds of church, the kinds of people who say, hey, come sit down at the table with me. Come over to the house. Let's have a conversation. Let's be friends. Let's get to know each other better for the purpose, ultimately, of introducing people to Jesus. Because here's the thing, we can't make sure, and there's a lot of great churches in this community. I want to say that on the record. But at the same time, we can't make sure every church in the 478 is for the 478. We just can't do that. That's impossible. That's not our job. We don't police other churches. But we can make sure we are, can't we? We can make sure we take this seriously. We can make sure we're the kinds of people who are for our neighbors, our coworkers, our classmates. That those people that we're closest to in this community know that if there's at least one church in the community that's for them and wants to get to know them better, it's this church. Now, with all that said, let me try to apply this more specifically, and really going to apply this in 3 different directions. First of all, I would say some of us are maybe even already doing this, and I hope that you are. But some of us are inviting people to the table. We're inviting people over to the house. Some of us, like Matthew, after he meets Jesus, realize we have a responsibility to introduce the sick people, the unhealthy people we're connected to Jesus, so that he can do for them what he's already done for us. We understand that we have a responsibility to introduce the people in our lives who are far from God to Jesus, to let them know that he is for them, that he wants a relationship with them. And this is why instead of pulling away like the Pharisees, instead of looking down, this is why we build bridges. This is why we, instead of walking away, we invite them to our house, invite them to the table, invite them to church, invite them into conversations that can change the difference. And if if that's you, if you're someone who is inviting people to the table, if you're someone who's doing your best to connect to people far from God, you're ministering to tax collectors and sinners, you've got more than a few people that you would put in that category. If that's you, I want to encourage you to keep doing what you're doing. Keep having those conversations. Don't just trash those relationships now. Be careful. You need to have boundaries. When you're being pulled in the direction of their sin, you need to separate for a season. But there needs to be wisdom there. But ultimately, what does it look like for us to build bridges into the lives of people who are far from God, rather than what so many religious people, Christian people do, build walls? Second group of us in the room, I think, some of us are better at diagnosing than treating, aren't we? Some of us are better at diagnosing than treating. Some of us, in other words, are like the Pharisees. We not only know what's right, but we know what's wrong, and we're good at pointing it out, and we point it out all the time whether it's typing something out on social media to let everybody know we stand on truth, or just saying something to someone's face, or even talking like the Pharisees, talking about someone behind their back. But if we're honest, those of us who are good at diagnosing often aren't so good at helping. If I can say it this way, we're quicker to critique than we are to connect. We're quicker to post than we are to pray. We're quicker to argue than we are to invite. This is not just this is a me thing. We're all guilty of this from time to time. And when we do this sort of thing, here's what the problem is. We drift into the very posture that Jesus confronted so many years ago, don't we? We start thinking, that the church is for people who got their act together. The church is for the people who are healthy. That God is for people who aren't sick, when the opposite is true. Now, again, just to be clear, I'm not asking anyone to not tell the truth. I'm not saying that at all. And sometimes you do have to confront sin, and you do have to call it out, and you do have to address it. Sometimes that's absolutely necessary. Truth is fantastic, and it's important. But mercy, to quote Jesus, is what reveals the heart of God to people. So yeah, you can go drop your truth bombs if you want to on all sorts of people that you're connected to. But you know what would probably be better for you is to show them some mercy, to give them some grace, to extend some compassion, to let them know that you love them and you're for them. And yeah, you disagree with them, but that doesn't mean you're going to end the friendship. Yeah, you approach life in a completely different way. You look at it through a completely different set of lenses, but that doesn't mean you can't be friends. And honestly, I would argue that if your commitment to holiness has created distance instead of compassion, you have missed something. If you're committed, and I'm committed to holiness and righteousness. I want to live for the Lord. I want to please Him in every area of my life. But if our commitment to holiness has caused us to create distance instead of compassion, to move away instead of to move closer, we've missed the point. And we need to do what Jesus told the Pharisees to do so many years ago. We need to go and learn. We need to dive into the scriptures and really see the heart of God. And then the third group, maybe some of us are still at the table. Some of us are at the tax collecting booth, maybe still. Some of us are at the table in Matthew's house in some way. But just like Matthew, maybe you're this morning, you're not the Christian who needs to grow in your relationship. You're the sinner who needs saving. You're not a tax collector who's far from God, but you are far from God. And some of you, if you are far from God, and please know, we're so happy you're here. We're so happy you're here. But here's what I know about you. You probably assume that God is disappointed in you. You assume that people are judging you. You assume you've gone too far. But here's what I would tell you. And I hope this will encourage you. And I hope you'll listen to this. I hope you'll really digest this and take this in. Jesus still walks towards tax collector booths. Jesus still walks towards messy people in messy situations. Jesus still moves toward people who feel disqualified, who feel unclean. He still says to anyone and everyone, follow me. Link up with me. Let's do this thing together. He doesn't say, He doesn't say, fix yourself first, then we'll have a conversation. He doesn't say, clean up your mess. He doesn't say, prove your worth, and then maybe you can start following me. He doesn't say any of those things. He says exactly what he says to Matthew. Follow me. You're not too messy. You're not too outside the reach of grace. And while you may feel like everyone is against you, I hope you don't feel that way here, but you may feel like almost everyone is against you. Again, I want to reiterate, Jesus is for you. He wants a relationship with you, and he wants that relationship to begin today. So, if you're still sitting at your tax collecting booth, whatever that is, whatever it is that represents your old way of life, if you're still there, caught up in that, stuck in that, it's time, like Matthew did, to get up from your tax collecting booth and start walking and following Jesus, saying yes to Jesus, surrendering your life to Jesus. One final thing. I want to be overly clear on this because some people love to just take one thing and try to move in a direction. So I want to be overly clear on this. We don't move toward people, lost people, messy people, because we agree with them. We move toward messy people because that's what Jesus did for us. So we don't move towards messy people so we can get in the mess and get messy with them. We move towards messy people because that's exactly what Jesus did for us. We are for the sinner around here. Why? Because we were sinners. We know what that's like. We are for the skeptic because some of us used to be. And if you're a skeptic, I love talking to skeptics. I love having conversations with skeptics. I love debating and talking about issues and tough, difficult conversations. I love that. We are for the hypocrite because we've all said one thing and done another, every single one of us. We are for the messy because our stories aren't clean either. And yes, just to be clear, we are against sin, right? We are against sin. We are absolutely unapologetically against sin, but we are also unapologetically for sinners, for people who are far from God, because Jesus was for us while we were still sinners. The book of Romans says Christ died for us. And sinners don't need us to diagnose them. They already know, I promise. They need us to point them to the only one who can help them get better, who can help them get healthy. They need us to point them to Jesus. So let's do that, and let's do that together.